The frost came early to the high desert that November of 1883, turning the sagebrush silver and the air sharp enough to cut lungs with each breath. Margaret Louise held her 3-month-old daughter closer to her chest as the wagon wheel splintered beneath them, sending her husband Thomas pitching forward into the rocky trail, where his skull met stone with a sound she would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life. The mule bolted, dragging what remained of their possessions into the gathering dusk, and Margaret found herself utterly alone on the trail between Sacramento and Pyramid City, Nevada, with a dead husband, a crying infant, and a cold that crept through her thin coat like death itself seeking company. She tried to pull Thomas from the trail, but his body had gone heavy in that terrible way that meant his soul had already fled. Blood pooled dark against the packed earth, and little Emma's cries grew weaker in the freezing air. Margaret wrapped every piece of clothing she could salvage around her daughter, tearing strips from her own petticoat. But the cold was relentless, the kind of cold that November sometimes brought to the high desert when the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the temperature plummeted 30 degrees in an hour. Margaret started walking, stumbling really, her feet catching on rocks she could barely see in the failing light. Emma had stopped crying, which terrified her more than the wailing had. The baby felt stiff in her arms, her tiny lips taking on a bluish tint that made Margaret's heart clench with a fear so profound it threatened to stop her legs from moving altogether. She sang every lullaby she knew, her voice cracking in the frozen air, her breath coming out in desperate clouds that dissipated as quickly as her hope. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, winding through rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation that offered no shelter, no warmth, no salvation. Margaret's fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and she could no longer feel her toes in her boots. Emma lay perfectly still now, her small chest barely moving, and Margaret knew with absolute certainty that her daughter was freezing to death in her arms. She tried to blow warm breath on the baby's face, tried to tuck her inside her coat against her skin, but nothing seemed to help. The cold was winning. She thought about Thomas lying dead on the trail behind her, thought about the life they had planned in Pyramid City, where his brother ran a mercantile and had promised Thomas work. They had left Sacramento with such hope, such determination to build something better than the poverty they had known. Now Thomas would never see his brother again, and Margaret would likely die on this God-forsaken trail with their daughter, 3 bodies for the coyotes to find when spring came. Her legs gave out near a stand of juniper trees, and she collapsed to her knees, clutching Emma against her chest. The baby's skin felt like ice beneath the layers of fabric. Margaret pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and felt nothing, no warmth, no response, just terrible cold stillness that made her want to scream at the uncaring stars beginning to emerge overhead. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. At first, she thought she was imagining them, that her mind was creating sounds of rescue because the alternative was too horrible to accept. But the hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather, and then a voice called out through the darkness, rough and urgent. "Hello, the trail. Anyone out here?" Margaret tried to answer, but her voice came out as little more than a croak. She tried again, forcing air through her frozen throat. "Help! Please help us!" The hoofbeats quickened, and suddenly a horse emerged from the gloom, a big buckskin gelding with a rider who swung down before the animal had fully stopped. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He carried a rifle that he set aside as he dropped to his knees beside Margaret. "Madam, are you hurt? What happened?" His voice carried the accent of someone raised in Texas or Oklahoma, somewhere south and warm, which seemed impossibly distant now. "My husband," Margaret gasped, pointing back down the trail. "The wagon broke. He fell. He's dead. My baby, please, my baby is freezing." The cowboy pulled back the layers of fabric around Emma, and even in the darkness, Margaret saw his jaw tighten. He pressed 2 fingers against the baby's tiny neck, holding perfectly still for a long moment. "She's alive, but barely. How long have you been out here?" "Hours, I think." "Since before sunset. I tried to keep her warm, but I couldn't. The cold just kept taking her." The cowboy was already shrugging out of his sheepskin coat. Underneath, he wore a flannel shirt and a leather vest, and Margaret wanted to protest that he would freeze too, but he was already wrapping the coat around both her and Emma, his movements quick and efficient. "My name is Yates Brennan. I'm taking you both to Pyramid City. It's about 15 miles north. We need to move fast." "My husband," Margaret said again, but Yates was already lifting her into his arms, baby and all, as though they weighed nothing. "I'm sorry about your husband, madam, but the living need tending first. I'll send someone back for him once we get you safe." He settled her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her waist to hold her in place. The sheepskin coat enveloped them both, and his body heat against her back felt like heaven and hell combined, wonderful warmth that only emphasized how close to death they had come. Yates spurred the buckskin into a smooth canter that ate up the trail without jarring them too badly. Margaret could feel the strength in his arm around her, the solid wall of his chest at her back, and for the first time since Thomas had fallen, she felt something other than terror. She felt a tiny flicker of hope. "What's your name, madam?" Yates asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Margaret Louise. My daughter is Emma. We were traveling from Sacramento to meet my husband's brother in Pyramid City." "Henry Louise. He runs the mercantile." "Yes, do you know him?" "Everyone knows Henry. Good man. He'll be devastated about your husband. What was his name?" "Thomas." "Thomas Louise." Yates said the name like a prayer. "I'll make sure he gets a proper burial, Mrs. Louise. You have my word." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked down at Emma, trying to see if there was any change in the baby's condition, but it was too dark and they were moving too fast. All she could do was hold her daughter close and pray. Yates pushed the buckskin hard, the horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth of the trail. The night air rushed past them, even colder at this speed, but the sheepskin coat and Yates's body heat created a pocket of relative warmth. Margaret felt herself leaning back against him, exhausted beyond measure, her body finally giving in to the trauma of the past hours. "Stay with me, Mrs. Louise," Yates said, his voice firm. "I need you to stay awake and keep that baby warm. Talk to her, sing to her, anything. We've got a ways to go yet." Margaret forced her eyes open and began singing again, the same lullabies she had sung while stumbling alone in the dark, but this time her voice didn't sound quite so desperate. This time, they were moving toward help instead of wandering aimlessly toward death. "That's good," Yates encouraged. "Keep singing. Your voice will help her remember to hang on." "How do you know about babies?" Margaret asked, her words slurring slightly. "Grew up with 6 younger sisters. Helped raise most of them after Ma died. I know a thing or two about keeping little ones alive." The information surprised her. She had assumed he was just a drifter, a cowboy moving from job to job, but there was clearly more to Yates Brennan than met the eye. "Where are your sisters now?" Scattered across 3 states, all married with families of their own. "I get letters when the mail catches up with me." "And you work in Pyramid City?" "I ranch about 10 miles outside town. Been there 5 years now, building up a small herd. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." Margaret found comfort in his voice. in the steady rhythm of his words matching the rhythm of the horse's gait. She kept singing to Emma, kept praying that her daughter would survive this terrible night, kept leaning into the warmth of the stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayers she had not had time to properly form. They rode for what felt like hours, though Margaret had lost all sense of time. Occasionally, Yates would check on them, asking if she was still awake, reminding her to keep the baby warm. Once, he stopped long enough to wrap an extra blanket around them that he pulled from his saddlebags, and Margaret caught a glimpse of his face in the starlight. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his late 20s, with a strong jaw and eyes that held both kindness and determination. "How much farther?" she asked as he remounted. "About 5 miles. There's a doctor in Pyramid City, Doc Harrison. He's good with children. Delivered half the babies in town." Yates settled behind her again, his arm returning to its protective position around her waist. "Your little girl is a fighter, Mrs. Louise. I can feel her breathing, and it's stronger than when I first found you." Margaret pressed her hand against Emma's chest and felt the slight rise and fall. Yates was right. It was still terrifyingly shallow, but it was there, persistent, stubborn. "Please, God, let her live," Margaret whispered. "He will," Yates said with such certainty that Margaret wanted to believe him. "I've seen worse odds than this turn out fine. You just keep praying and keep her warm." The lights of Pyramid City appeared in the distance, a scattering of golden pinpricks against the dark desert. Margaret felt tears streaming down her frozen cheeks, tears of relief and grief and exhaustion all mixed together. They were going to make it. Whatever happened next, they had survived the trail. Yates guided the buckskin straight down the main street, calling out to people who emerged from saloons and shops to see what the commotion was about. "Someone fetch Doc Harrison. Tell him we've got a baby who's been exposed to the cold, and someone find Henry Louise." People scattered in different directions, and Yates pulled up in front of a 2-story building with a painted sign that read "Doctor's Office." He dismounted and lifted Margaret down, still wrapped in his coat, then pushed open the door without bothering to knock. Inside, a fire burned in a potbelly stove, and the warmth hit Margaret like a physical force. An older man with white hair and spectacles looked up from a medical journal, his expression shifting immediately from annoyance at the intrusion to professional concern. "Yates, what have you got?" "Baby exposed to the cold for hours, Doc. Mother too, but the baby is in worse shape." Doc Harrison gestured to an examination table near the fire. "Bring them here. Yates, add more wood to that stove, get it as hot as it will go." Yates set Margaret on the table and helped her unwrap Emma from the layers of fabric. In the lamplight, the baby's condition was shockingly clear. Her skin had a bluish tint, her lips were almost purple, and her tiny body was rigid and cold. Doc Harrison took her immediately, his experienced hands moving quickly but gently. "How long was she exposed?" he asked, carrying Emma closer to the stove. "Her husband died on the trail several hours before sunset," Yates answered when Margaret could not find words. "She's been walking since then, trying to keep the baby warm." Doc Harrison nodded, his face grave. He began removing Emma's frozen clothing, replacing it with warm blankets he pulled from a cabinet near the fire. "We need to warm her slowly. Too fast and it could stop her heart. Mrs. Louise, can you tell me if she's been crying, moving, anything?" Margaret forced herself to speak. "She cried at first, but then she got quiet. She stopped moving maybe an hour before Mr. Brennan found us. I thought she was dying. Is she dying? Not if I can help it." Doc Harrison placed his stethoscope against Emma's tiny chest, listening intently. "Her heartbeat is slow but steady. That's good. Her breathing is shallow but present. Also good. Children are remarkably resilient, Mrs. Louise. I've seen babies survive things that would kill a grown man." The door burst open, and a man who looked remarkably like Thomas rushed in, his face pale with fear. "Margaret, Yates said something about Thomas being dead. What happened? Where's my brother?" Margaret started to cry in earnest then, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Henry Louise crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped his arms around her, and she clung to him like a drowning woman, the only family she had left in the world. "The wagon broke," she managed between sobs. "He fell, hit his head on the rocks. He died instantly, Henry. I couldn't save him." "I tried, but I couldn't." Henry held her tighter, his own tears falling into her hair. "It's not your fault, Margaret. These trails are dangerous. Everyone knows that. Oh God, Thomas, my little brother." Yates stood near the door, his hat in his hands, watching the scene with obvious discomfort. Margaret pulled away from Henry enough to look at the cowboy who had saved them. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for finding us. Without you, Emma and I would have died out there." Yates shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I'm just glad I decided to ride back tonight instead of waiting until morning. I was checking on some cattle in the high country and was going to camp, but something told me to push on home." "Providence," Doc Harrison said without looking up from Emma. "I believe in it, especially on nights like this." "Will my niece survive, Doc?" Henry asked, his voice shaking. "I believe so, but the next few hours are critical. Mrs. Louise, you need to get warm yourself. Yates, take her to the back room and help her get out of those frozen clothes. There are blankets and a nightgown in the cabinet. Henry, you stay here and help me with the baby." Yates looked even more uncomfortable at the prospect of helping Margaret undress, but he nodded and offered her his arm. Margaret's legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand, and Yates caught her, supporting most of her weight as he guided her to the back room. The small room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and the cabinet Doc Harrison had mentioned. Yates opened it and pulled out a thick flannel nightgown and several wool blankets. He set them on the bed, then turned his back to give her privacy. "Can you manage, or do you need help?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Margaret tried to unbutton her coat, but her fingers would not cooperate. They were still too cold, too stiff, and the buttons might as well have been made of iron for all the success she had moving them. "I cannot feel my hands," she admitted, humiliated. Yates turned back around, his expression carefully professional. "All right, let's get you warm then." He unbuttoned her coat with efficient movements, then helped her out of it. Her dress was next, the fabric frozen in places where her desperate movements had made her sweat, that then turned to ice. Yates worked the buttons and laces with the same matter-of-fact competence he had shown throughout the ordeal, never letting his eyes linger, never making her feel anything other than cared for. When she was down to her chemise and he helped her pull the nightgown over her head, Margaret realized she was shaking violently, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might crack. Yates wrapped blanket after blanket around her, then guided her to sit on the bed. "You need to drink something warm. I'll get you some tea." He started for the door, then paused. "Mrs. Louise, you did everything right out there. You kept your daughter alive against terrible odds. Your husband would be proud." Fresh tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but she nodded. Yates left, closing the door quietly behind him, and Margaret let herself cry for Thomas, for the life they would never have, for the terror of nearly losing Emma, for all of it. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Yates was gently shaking her shoulder, a steaming cup in his hand. "Doc says you need to drink this. It's got honey and whiskey in it. It will help warm you from the inside." Margaret took the cup with shaking hands and sipped. The liquid burned going down, but it was a good burn, spreading warmth through her chest and into her limbs. She drank it all, and Yates took the empty cup with an approving nod. "Emma," Margaret asked. "Her color is better. She's starting to move a little. Doc thinks she's going to pull through." Margaret closed her eyes and sent up a prayer of thanksgiving so fervent it left her breathless. "Can I see her?" "In a bit. Doc wants you to get warm first. He said hypothermia can sneak up on you, make you think you are fine when you are not." Yates pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. "Mrs. Louise, I need to know where your husband is exactly so I can send someone to bring him back. Can you describe the location?" Margaret did her best to explain where the wagon had broken, where Thomas's body lay. Yates listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, clearly forming a mental map. "I'll ride out at first light with some men. We'll bring him back for a proper burial. Thank you. I have no money to pay you, no way to repay any of this kindness." Yates waved a hand dismissively. "I don't want payment for doing the right thing. Besides, Henry will help you. He's a good man, and you are family to him." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the crackling of the stove fire from the other room. Margaret studied Yates in the lamplight, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save them. He had a strong, weathered face, the kind carved by years of outdoor work and harsh conditions. His eyes were a pale blue, striking against his sun-darkened skin, and there was something steady about him, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. "Why were you on the trail so late?" she asked. "Like I said, checking cattle. I've got about 200 head scattered across a few thousand acres. You have to ride out regularly to make sure they have not wandered off or gotten into trouble. I was up in the high country near where the trail passes through and decided to head home instead of camping." He looked at her intently. "I'm mighty glad I did. So am I." Margaret felt her eyes growing heavy again. The warmth, the exhaustion, the emotional toll of the day, it was all catching up with her. "You should sleep," Yates said, standing. "I'll check on your daughter and let you know if anything changes." "Wait." Margaret reached out and caught his hand. "Will you stay? I know it is improper, but I am afraid to be alone right now." Yates looked at their joined hands for a moment, then nodded. He pulled the chair even closer and sat back down, his large hand engulfing hers. "I'll stay as long as you need me to, Mrs. Louise." Margaret fell asleep, holding the hand of a man she had known for only a few hours, but who had already become the most important person in her world after Emma and Henry. She dreamed of Thomas, of him smiling at her the way he had on their wedding day, telling her it was all right, that she would be all right, that Emma would grow up strong and beautiful. When she woke several hours later, dawn light was creeping through the single window, and Yates was asleep in the chair, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, his hand still holding hers. Margaret studied him in the growing light, noting details she had missed in the darkness and chaos of the night before. He was handsome in a rugged way, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a small scar on his chin that looked like it had come from a knife or broken bottle. His hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had. He wore no wedding ring, and she wondered about that, wondered why a man like this was alone. As though sensing her gaze, Yates's eyes opened. For a moment he looked disoriented, then his expression cleared and he sat up straighter. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Warmer. Still sad, but better." Margaret squeezed his hand before releasing it. "How is Emma? Doc says she's doing well." "Her temperature is almost normal, and she was fussing for food about an hour ago. That's a good sign." "Can I see her now? I'll check with Doc." Yates stood, stretching out the kinks from sleeping in a chair, then left the room. He returned a moment later with Emma bundled in blankets, the baby's eyes open and alert. Margaret burst into tears at the sight, reaching out for her daughter with shaking arms. Doc Harrison followed Yates into the room, smiling at Margaret's reaction. "She's going to be fine, Mrs. Louise. A little frostbite on her toes and fingers, but nothing that will not heal. You got her help just in time." Margaret held Emma close, breathing in her baby smell, feeling the warmth of her small body, the steady beat of her heart. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much." "Thank Yates. He's the one who brought you in. Now you need to rest for a few more days, let your body recover from the exposure. Henry has offered his home to you and the baby, and I think that is the best place for you right now." "What about Thomas?" Margaret asked, looking at Yates. "I'm heading out now with Henry and a few others. We'll bring him back and arrange for a funeral tomorrow if the preacher is available. You don't need to worry about any of it. Henry and I will handle everything." Margaret wanted to protest, wanted to say she should be involved in burying her husband, but the truth was she had no energy for it, no strength to face what needed to be done. "All right, thank you." Yates put his hat on and nodded to her. "I'll check on you later, Mrs. Louise. You take care of yourself and that baby." After he left, Doc Harrison helped Margaret into a dress that Henry had brought from his home, something that had belonged to his wife before she passed away 3 years earlier. It was a simple calico print, well made and warm, and it fit Margaret reasonably well. Then the doctor walked her and Emma to Henry's home, a tidy frame house behind the mercantile. Henry's wife Clara met them at the door, her face kind and concerned. She was a small woman with dark hair and eyes that held genuine warmth. "You poor dear. Come in, come in. I've got the spare room all ready for you." The next few days passed in a blur. Thomas was buried in the Pyramid City Cemetery on a cold, windy afternoon with half the town in attendance. Margaret stood at the graveside holding Emma, Henry on one side and Yates on the other, and listened to the preacher talk about eternal rest and God's mercy. She cried quiet tears that froze on her cheeks, and when it was over, Yates walked her back to Henry's house without saying a word, his presence a comfort in itself. He came by every day after that, always bringing something: fresh meat from a deer he had shot, vegetables from a neighbor's root cellar, firewood for Henry's stove. He would sit in the kitchen and drink coffee with Henry while Margaret rested in the spare room, and sometimes she would hear them talking in low voices about the ranch, about cattle prices, about the weather. A week after the funeral, Margaret felt strong enough to join them in the kitchen. She came out holding Emma, who was thriving now, her color healthy and her appetite voracious. Yates stood when Margaret entered, pulling out a chair for her in a gesture that was both courtly and natural. "You look better," he observed, his blue eyes taking in her improved color and steadier movements. "I feel better. Doc Harrison says I am healing well." Margaret sat down and adjusted Emma in her arms. "I have been thinking about what I am going to do. Henry has been generous, but I cannot stay here forever. I need to find work, find a way to support myself and Emma." Henry frowned. "Margaret, you are family. You can stay as long as you need to. I know, and I am grateful, but I need to build a life for Emma and myself. I was wondering if there are any positions in town. Can I work at the mercantile, perhaps?" "You could," Henry said slowly, "but you would need someone to watch Emma during the day. There's a woman who runs a boarding house, Mrs. Patterson, who takes in children sometimes. It's not ideal, but it would work." Yates set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Or there's another option." Both Margaret and Henry looked at him. Yates seemed to be struggling with something, his jaw working as though he was trying to decide whether to speak. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Louise, I want to make you a proposition. Hear me out before you say anything." Margaret's heart started beating faster. She had no idea what he was going to say, but something in his tone made her nervous and hopeful at the same time. My ranch is doing well, but I need help. I need someone to keep the house, do the cooking, things like that. I've been living like a bachelor for too long and it's not efficient. I'm offering you a job as my housekeeper. You and Emma would live in the ranch house with me. There are 2 bedrooms, so everything would be proper. I'd pay you a fair wage and you would not have to worry about finding someone to watch Emma. She could be with you all day. Margaret stared at him, hardly able to process what he was saying. You want me to be your housekeeper? Yes. And before you think this is charity, it's not. I genuinely need the help and you are good with household matters. I've seen how you keep Henry's kitchen organized, how you manage things even while recovering. You would be doing me a favor. Henry was frowning. Yates, I don't know if that's appropriate. Margaret is a young widow and you are a bachelor. People will talk. Let them talk, Yates said flatly. I'm more concerned about Mrs. Louise and Emma having a stable place to live than what the gossips say. Besides, everything will be completely proper. Mrs. Louise will have her own room with a lock on the door. I'll make sure she is treated with nothing but respect. Margaret looked between the 2 men, her mind racing. The offer was generous, almost too generous, and she wondered if there was more to it than Yates was saying. But when she met his eyes, she saw only sincerity and a kind of desperate hope that he was trying to hide. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. Yates stood, clearly uncomfortable now that he had made his offer. I should get going, got cattle to check on. After he left, Henry turned to Margaret with a concerned expression. You don't have to accept his offer. I meant what I said about you staying here. I know you did, Henry, and I love you for it, but Mr. Brennan is right. I need to support myself and Emma, and working at his ranch would allow me to do that while keeping my daughter with me. That is important to me. Just be careful, Margaret. Yates is a good man, but he's been alone for a long time. I don't want you to get hurt. Margaret nodded, but she was thinking about the way Yates had held her on his horse, the way his hand had felt holding hers, the way he looked at Emma with such gentleness. She was thinking about a lot of things that had nothing to do with being careful. 2 days later, she sent word through Henry that she would accept the position. Yates came to town that afternoon with a wagon, his face carefully neutral but his eyes bright with something that might have been relief or joy or both. He loaded her few belongings, the things that had been salvaged from the wagon wreck along with some items Henry had given her, and helped her up onto the wagon seat with Emma in her arms. The ride to the ranch took about an hour, the trail winding through high desert country scattered with sagebrush and juniper trees. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with snow, and the sky was the kind of endless blue that seemed unique to Nevada. Yates pointed out landmarks as they rode. The creek where he got water, the pastures where the cattle grazed, the line of trees that marked his property boundary. The ranch house was a low, sturdy structure made of logs and stone, sitting in a small valley with a barn and several outbuildings nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Margaret saw that someone had recently repaired the front porch. It was modest but well-maintained, the home of a man who took pride in what he had built. Yates helped her down and showed her inside. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room all in one, with a stone fireplace at one end and a cast iron stove near the work counter. 2 doors led off the main room, and Yates opened one to show her a small bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out on the barn. This would be your room. I'll move Emma's cradle in here, and there's space for more furniture if you need it. The lock works, and I'll give you the only key. Margaret stepped inside, setting Emma on the bed while she looked around. The room was clean but sparse, clearly not used for much. What was this room before? Storage, mostly. I built the house with 2 bedrooms thinking I might marry someday, but that never happened. Why not? The question was out before Margaret could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it. "I am sorry, that's not my business. It's all right." Yates leaned against the door frame, his expression thoughtful. "I was engaged once, about 6 years ago. Girl I grew up with back in Texas. She decided she did not want to marry a cowboy after all and ran off with a banker. After that, I threw myself into building this ranch, and before I knew it, years had passed and I was still alone. I am sorry. Don't be. Looking back, I think she did me a favor. We were not suited." He pushed off the door frame and gestured to the main room. "Let me show you where everything is, and then I'll let you get settled." Over the next hour, Yates walked her through the house, showing her the root cellar, the pantry, the various supplies he had stored up for winter. He had clearly been preparing for her arrival because there were staples she knew he would not normally keep. Extra flour, sugar, bolts of cloth, things a woman and baby would need. The realization that he had been planning this, hoping she would say yes, touched her deeply. "I usually eat simple food," Yates said, almost apologetically. "Beans, bacon, bread. But you are welcome to cook whatever you like. Henry gave me some recipes his wife used to make, and I got the ingredients for them. I'm happy to eat whatever you want to prepare." "I am a decent cook," Margaret assured him. "My mother taught me well, I'm sure you are." Yates picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. "I'll leave you to get settled. I've got work to do in the barn, but if you need anything, just call out. I'll hear you." After he left, Margaret stood in the middle of the main room holding Emma and looked around at what was now her home. It was strange and frightening and oddly exciting all at once. She was living with a man who was essentially a stranger, a man who had saved her life and offered her refuge when she had nowhere else to go. A man who made her feel things she had no business feeling so soon after her husband's death. She pushed those thoughts away and focused on the practical. Emma needed to be fed and changed. The house needed to be properly explored so Margaret knew where everything was. Dinner needed to be planned and prepared. She could worry about her confusing feelings later. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Margaret would wake early to start the stove and begin breakfast while Emma slept in her cradle. Yates would come in from doing early chores, wash up at the basin by the door, and sit down to whatever she had prepared. They would eat together, talking about simple things: the weather, the cattle, Margaret's plans for the day. Then Yates would head back out to work, and Margaret would spend her day cleaning, cooking, mending, and caring for Emma. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together, and afterward, Yates would often sit by the fire and read while Margaret sewed or worked on other projects. Sometimes they talked, conversations that grew longer and more personal as they became comfortable with each other. Margaret learned about Yates's childhood in Texas, about losing his mother to cholera when he was 15, about raising his sisters while his father drank himself to death. Yates learned about Margaret's life in Sacramento, about her parents dying in a fire when she was 17, about meeting Thomas at church and marrying him 3 months later. "You regret it?" Yates asked one evening. "Marrying Thomas?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "No. Thomas was a good man, and I cared for him deeply. But I think we married more out of necessity than love. I needed someone to take care of me, and he wanted a wife. We made it work, and we would have been happy in our way, but it was not the great love story people write songs about." "Do you believe in those great love stories?" "I do not know, I want to, but life seems more practical than that most of the time." Yates stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. "Maybe, or maybe we just have not seen enough of life yet." December came, bringing with it snow that blanketed the high desert and turned the ranch into something out of a Christmas card. Margaret bundled Emma in layers of flannel and wool, marveling at how much the baby had grown in just a few weeks. She was thriving, her cheeks round and pink, her eyes bright and curious. Sometimes Margaret would catch Yates looking at Emma with such tenderness that it made her chest ache. One evening, Margaret was cooking dinner when Yates came in from the barn carrying a small evergreen tree. "I thought we should have a Christmas tree," he said, almost shyly. "For Emma's first Christmas. Well, her first real Christmas that she will remember eventually." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "That is so thoughtful. Where did you get it?" "Cut it myself up in the high country." "I'll make a stand for it, and we can decorate it with whatever we can find. Popcorn strings, paper decorations, that sort of thing." They spent the next few evenings making decorations, sitting by the fire with Emma between them on a blanket. Yates carved small animals out of wood scraps, while Margaret cut paper snowflakes and sewed small fabric ornaments. It was domestic and intimate and wonderful, and Margaret found herself imagining this was her life, that Yates was her husband and Emma was their daughter, and this was how things had always been. The fantasy shattered when Yates said quietly, "You must miss Thomas terribly. This must be hard for you, facing your first Christmas without him." Margaret looked down at the ornament she was stitching, not trusting herself to meet Yates's eyes. "I do miss him, but not in the way you might think. I miss the idea of him, the life we were supposed to have. But the man himself, the reality of him, I am not sure I knew him well enough to truly miss him. We were married less than a year, and he worked long hours. We barely saw each other. That does not make it less of a loss. No, it does not." Margaret set down her sewing and looked at Yates directly. "But I am not going to pretend to be more grief-stricken than I am. Thomas deserves honesty, even in death. I cared for him, but I did not love him the way a wife should love a husband, and I think he felt the same way about me." Yates held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Emma fussed, breaking the tension, and Margaret picked up her daughter and carried her to the bedroom to nurse. That night, lying in her narrow bed with Emma asleep in the cradle beside her, Margaret admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Yates Brennan. It was too soon, too fast, too complicated, but it was happening anyway. She loved the way he was gentle with Emma, the way he listened when she talked, the way he made her feel safe and valued. She loved his quiet strength, his dry humor, his determination to make something of himself despite all the hardships he had faced. But she had no idea if he felt the same way, and she was terrified to find out. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret woke to find that Yates had already stoked the fire and started coffee. He stood by the little tree, adding the last few decorations they had made, and when he turned and saw her, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the Mrs. Louise attached. It felt significant, intimate in a way that made her cheeks flush. "Merry Christmas, Yates." They had a simple breakfast, then Yates disappeared into his room and came back carrying 2 packages wrapped in brown paper. He handed one to Margaret and set the other by Emma's cradle. "You did not have to get me anything," Margaret protested, touched and embarrassed that she had nothing to give him in return. "Open it," Yates urged, looking nervous. Margaret unwrapped the paper to find a beautiful shawl made of soft blue wool. It was clearly expensive, the kind of thing she never would have bought for herself. "Yates, this is too much." "No, it's not. You need a good shawl for winter, and I wanted to get you something nice." He shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "Do you like it?" "I love it, thank you." Margaret wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, feeling the warmth and weight of it, feeling cherished in a way she had not felt in a long time. The package for Emma contained a tiny dress of soft pink fabric and a carved wooden rattle. Margaret held them up, her eyes filling with tears. "These are perfect. How did you know what size to get?" asked Mrs. Patterson in town. "She's got grandchildren." Yates picked up Emma from her cradle and held her with the ease of someone who had done this before. "I wanted her to have something special for her first Christmas." Margaret watched him holding her daughter, this strong, capable man who had saved them both and then given them a home, and she could not hold back anymore. "Yates, I need to tell you something." He looked at her, his expression cautious. "All right. I know I have not been widowed very long. I know people would say it is too soon, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the night you found us on the trail. And I need you to know that, even if you do not feel the same way, even if this ruins everything." Yates stood very still, Emma cradled against his chest, his blue eyes locked on Margaret's face. "You are not ruining anything," he said quietly. "Because I fell in love with you the moment I saw you on that trail, holding your baby and refusing to give up even though you were freezing to death. I fell in love with your strength, your determination, your love for your daughter, and I have been falling deeper ever since." Margaret felt like she could not breathe. "Truly, truly." Yates walked closer, careful not to jostle Emma. "I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care about any of that. I care about you and Emma. I care about building a life together if you will have me." "What are you saying?" "I am saying I want to marry you, Margaret Louise. I want to be Emma's father and your husband. I want to wake up every morning and see you in my kitchen. I want to build this ranch with you, raise children with you, grow old with you." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "I am saying I love you, and I do not want to waste any more time pretending I do not." Margaret crossed the distance between them and stood on her toes to kiss him, a gentle press of lips that tasted like coffee and promise. Yates kissed her back carefully, mindful of the baby between them, and when they pulled apart they were both smiling. "Is that a yes?" Yates asked. "That is a yes. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want all of those things too." Margaret touched his face, marveling that this was real, that this man loved her and wanted her. "How soon can we do this?" "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you like. We will ride into town and talk to the preacher." "What about people judging us? Me being a widow for such a short time?" "Let them judge. We know the truth, and that is all that matters. Besides, anyone with eyes can see how I feel about you. The whole town probably already has an opinion about it." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the church in Pyramid City. Henry gave Margaret away, tears streaming down his face as he placed her hand in Yates's. Emma slept through the entire ceremony, oblivious to the fact that she was gaining a father. Doc Harrison and Mrs. Patterson served as witnesses, and afterward there was a small celebration at the Mercantile with cake and coffee. "I am happy for you both," Henry said, hugging Margaret tightly. "Thomas would want this. He would want you and Emma to be taken care of, to be loved." Margaret believed him. She thought Thomas was probably looking down at all of this and smiling, glad that his daughter would have a father and his wife would have a partner. Life was strange that way, taking away and giving back in unexpected measures. The ride back to the ranch felt different now. Margaret was Yates's wife, and the ranch was her home in truth, not just in practice. When they arrived, Yates carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests, Emma still bundled in her arms, and set her down gently in the middle of the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice full of emotion. "It feels right," Margaret said, looking around at the space that was now truly theirs. "Being your wife, being here, it all feels right." That night, after Emma was asleep in her cradle, Yates led Margaret to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom. He had cleaned it thoroughly and added feminine touches. A vase for flowers on the dresser, extra blankets on the bed, a comfortable chair by the window. He had been planning this, hoping for it, and the realization made Margaret love him even more. Their first night together was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches. Yates treated Margaret like she was precious, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished and desired. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Margaret's head on Yates's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I could be this happy," Margaret said softly. "After everything that happened, after losing Thomas and nearly losing Emma, I thought happiness was something other people had. But here I am, married to the most wonderful man I have ever known, safe and warm and loved." Yates kissed the top of her head. "You deserve happiness, Margaret. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and when Margaret woke in the middle of the night to feed Emma, Yates woke too, lighting a lamp and sitting with her while she nursed, his hand resting on her shoulder in silent support. It was such a small thing, but it spoke volumes about the kind of partner he would be, the kind of father he would be to Emma. Winter gave way to spring, and the ranch came alive with new grass and wildflowers. Margaret planted a garden near the house, rows of vegetables and herbs that would feed them through the summer and into the next winter. Yates expanded the herd, buying more cattle at good prices and hiring a young ranch hand named Peter to help with the work. Emma grew rapidly, hitting milestones that delighted both Margaret and Yates. She smiled, then laughed, then started reaching for things with determined little hands. Yates was completely smitten with her, spending every spare moment playing with her, making her laugh, teaching her to grab his fingers. To anyone who did not know the truth, they looked like a natural family, and Margaret supposed they were. Blood did not make a family. Love did. In May, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. She told Yates one evening after dinner, nervous about how he would react. They had not talked about more children, and she worried he might feel overwhelmed, but Yates's face lit up with pure joy. "Truly, we are having a baby, truly." "Are you happy about it?" "Happy." Yates pulled her into his arms and spun her around, laughing. "Margaret, I am thrilled. A baby, our baby. This is wonderful news." That night, lying in bed with Yates's hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, Margaret thought about the trail, about that terrible November night when she had been certain she and Emma would die. She thought about the wagon breaking, about Thomas falling, about the cold seeping into her bones. And she thought about Yates appearing out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer, wrapping them in his coat and riding through the night to save them. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, his voice sleepy. "About the night you found us. About how if you had decided to camp instead of riding home, Emma and I would have died. About how everything terrible that happened led to everything wonderful I have now." Yates was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking gentle circles on her stomach. "I think about that night too. Sometimes I dream about it, about almost being too late, about never finding you. And then I wake up and you are here beside me, and I realize it all worked out the way it was supposed to." "Do you believe that? That things work out the way they are supposed to?" "I do now. I did not used to, but you have changed the way I see the world. You have given me hope." Margaret turned in his arms so she could see his face in the moonlight coming through the window. "You gave me hope too. You gave me life, Yates. You saved Emma and me, and then you gave us a home and a family. I will never be able to repay that." "You do not need to repay it. Loving me is enough. Being here is enough. You are enough, Margaret." They kissed, slow and deep, and Yates made love to her with exquisite gentleness, mindful of the new life growing inside her. Afterward, Margaret fell asleep feeling completely content, Completely at peace with the path her life had taken, the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Margaret continued her work around the ranch, though Yates became increasingly protective as her belly grew. He hired a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, to help with the heavier housework, insisting that Margaret should rest more. Margaret protested that she was perfectly capable, but secretly she appreciated the help and the concern. Emma celebrated her first birthday in September with a small party attended by Henry, Doc Harrison, Mrs. Patterson, and a few other friends from town. She was walking now, toddling around the ranch with determination, getting into everything. Yates had built her a small wooden horse that she could ride around the main room, and she spent hours on it, babbling happily to herself. In late October, as the weather turned cold again and the anniversary of that terrible night on the trail approached, Margaret went into labor. It was different from Emma's birth, faster and more intense, and for a few hours she was frightened that something was wrong. But Doc Harrison had come to the ranch to stay with them as her due date approached, and he assured her everything was progressing normally. Yates stayed with her throughout the labor, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement even when Margaret screamed at him that this was all his fault. When their son finally came into the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the ranch house, Yates wept openly, holding the tiny, red-faced baby with shaking hands. "He's perfect," Yates said, his voice choked with emotion. "Margaret, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas Yates Brennan, honoring both the man who had helped give Margaret and Emma life and the man who had saved it. Henry cried when they told him, and he held his nephew with such tenderness that Margaret had to look away to compose herself. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. Emma adapted to having a brother with surprising grace, though she occasionally tried to share her wooden horse with him in ways that made Margaret's heart stop. Thomas was a calm baby, content to nurse and sleep and watch the world with solemn dark eyes that reminded Margaret of his father. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. The ranch prospered, growing from 200 head of cattle to 500, then 1,000. Yates hired more help and built additional outbuildings. Margaret's garden expanded, and she started selling her surplus vegetables in town. Emma grew into a bright, curious child who followed her father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the cattle. Thomas was quieter, more contemplative, but he had his father's work ethic and his mother's determination. In the spring of 1887, Margaret gave birth to twin girls, Hannah and Sarah, who turned the household into cheerful chaos. Yates built an addition onto the house, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch house that had once felt too big for a bachelor now rang with the sounds of children's laughter and family life. One November evening in 1889, 6 years after that terrible night on the trail, Margaret stood on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Emma was in the barn helping Yates with the evening chores, her 9-year-old voice carrying across the yard as she chattered about her day. Thomas was inside reading to the twins, his patient voice creating a soft background melody. Another baby was due in the spring, and Margaret rested her hand on her rounded stomach, marveling at how full her life had become. Yates emerged from the barn with Emma on his shoulders, both of them laughing about something. When he saw Margaret on the porch, his face softened into the expression he always wore when he looked at her, a combination of love and wonder and gratitude. He set Emma down, and she ran inside to join her siblings. Leaving Margaret and Yates alone in the gathering dusk, Yates climbed the porch steps and pulled Margaret into his arms, careful of her belly. "What are you thinking about?" "About how different my life is now compared to 6 years ago." about how I have been given so much more than I ever dreamed possible. Do you ever think about that night, about Thomas and the trail and the cold? Sometimes. Less than I used to, but sometimes. Margaret looked up at her husband, this man who had become her entire world. I think Thomas's death was a tragedy, and I will always be sorry for it. But I also think it brought me to you, and I cannot regret that. Does that make me a terrible person? No, it makes you human. It makes you someone who understands that life is complicated, that joy and sorrow can exist side by side, that we can honor the past while embracing the present. Yates kissed her forehead, then her lips. I love you, Margaret Brennan. I have loved you since the moment I found you refusing to give up on that frozen trail, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you. You saved my life that night, Yates. You saved Emma. But more than that, you gave us a family, a home, a future. You gave us everything. They stood together on the porch as the stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had watched them on that desperate night 6 years ago. But everything else was different now. The cold had been replaced by warmth, the fear by security, the loneliness by love. Margaret had lost a husband that November night, but she had gained so much more than she had lost. Inside, the children were getting ready for bed, their voices rising in the argument about who had to feed the dog. Margaret and Yates went in together to settle the dispute, working as a team the way they always did, the way they always would. After the children were finally asleep, Margaret and Yates sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arms wrapped around her. "Tell me again about that night," Margaret said softly. "About what you were thinking when you found us." Yates settled more comfortably, pulling a blanket over them both. "I was coming down from the high country, and I was tired and cold. I was debating whether to camp or push through to the ranch. Something told me to keep riding, a feeling I could not explain. Then I heard the wind change, and I thought I heard a voice calling for help. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, but I decided to check anyway. And then I saw you kneeling in the dark, holding Emma, and I knew immediately how dire the situation was. The cold, the isolation, the fact that you were alone. I have never moved faster in my life than I did getting you onto my horse and starting for town. Were you scared? Terrified?" "I kept checking to make sure Emma was still breathing, kept talking to you to make sure you stayed conscious. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life, making all sorts of promises to God if He would just let you both survive." "What kind of promises?" Yates smiled, his arms tightening around her. "I promised I would be a better man, that I would go to church more, that I would help people whenever I could. And I promised that if you lived, I would take care of you for the rest of your life if you would let me." Margaret had not heard this part before. "You promised that while we were riding." "I did. It seemed presumptuous at the time, considering you had a husband and I was a stranger, but I could not help it. Even then, half frozen and desperate, you were the strongest, most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I knew I wanted to know you better, to be part of your life somehow. And now you are stuck with me and our ever-growing brood of children. Stuck is not the word I would use. Blessed is more like it." Yates tilted her face up to kiss her properly. "You are my blessing, Margaret. You and every one of our children. This life we have built together is more than I ever hoped for." They sat together long into the night, talking about their plans for the ranch, about the children's futures, about the baby coming in the spring. They talked about Emma's wish to learn to read and write better so she could keep the ranch books when she was older, about Thomas's fascination with the natural world, and how he collected rocks and pressed flowers, about how the twins were developing distinct personalities despite looking identical. Eventually, they went to bed, And Yates made love to Margaret with the careful passion of a man who knows his wife's body as well as his own, who understands what she needs without her having to ask. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Yates's hand resting on her pregnant belly, Margaret thought about the trail one last time. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, about how a broken wagon wheel had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She thought about Thomas dying alone on the cold ground, and she sent him a mental thank you for the year they had shared, and for the daughter he had given her. She thought about Emma nearly freezing in her arms, that terrible stillness that had presaged death, and the miracle of her survival. But mostly, she thought about Yates appearing out of the darkness, wrapping them both in his coat, riding through the night to save them. She thought about how one man's decision to keep riding instead of making camp had saved 2 lives and created this whole beautiful family. She thought about love arriving in the most unexpected way, in the most desperate moment, and transforming everything. The baby kicked inside her, and Margaret smiled in the darkness. This child would grow up surrounded by love and siblings and wide open spaces. This child would never know the fear of freezing on a lonely trail, never know what it meant to be truly desperate. This child would have everything Margaret could give, including the story of how their family came to be, how tragedy and grace had woven together to create something beautiful. "What are you smiling about?" Yates murmured, half asleep. "Just thinking about how lucky I am, how lucky we all are. Not luck, love." Yates pulled her closer, his breathing already evening out into sleep. "It was always love." Margaret closed her eyes and let herself drift off, safe and warm and deeply content. The trail was far behind her now, that frozen November night, a memory that grew more distant with each passing year. But she would never forget it entirely because it had brought her here, to this life, to this man, to this overwhelming abundance of love. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and howling around the corners of the house. But inside, the Brennan family slept peacefully, protected from the cold by solid walls and warm blankets and the kind of love that could survive anything. The children dreamed their innocent dreams, and Margaret and Yates dreamed of the future they were building together. And the ranch stood strong against the Nevada winter, a testament to what could be built when 2 people decided to face life together. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. The baby Margaret carried that winter was another boy, whom they named Samuel. He had Yates's blue eyes and Margaret's stubborn streak, and he grew up to be a rancher like his father, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Yates aged. Emma married a young rancher from the next county over when she was 19. A good man named Daniel who treated her like a queen and gave Yates and Margaret their first grandchildren. Thomas became a teacher, his love of learning and gentle nature perfectly suited to educating the children of Pyramid City. The twins married brothers, causing endless confusion at family gatherings, and had houses right next to each other on the edge of town. Samuel took over the ranch completely when Yates was 60, though Yates still spent every day riding the property and checking on the cattle he loved. Margaret and Yates grew old together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming weathered by time and work, but their love never diminishing. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, holding hands the way they had since that first terrible night when he had held her hand to keep her from feeling alone. "You have any regrets?" Margaret asked him one evening when they were in their 60s, their children grown and scattered, their grandchildren running wild around the property. Yates thought about it seriously, the way he always considered her questions. "Not a single one. Every choice I made led me to you, and you are the best thing that ever happened to me." What about you? No regrets. I think about Thomas sometimes, about the life we might have had, but I cannot imagine any other life than this one. You and our children and this ranch, this is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence only possible between two people who have shared decades of life. The ranch stretched out before them, a thriving enterprise that employed a dozen men and supported multiple families. The house had been expanded twice more over the years, adding rooms for visiting children and grandchildren, but the heart of it was still that original log structure where Yates had brought Margaret as his housekeeper, where they had fallen in love, where they had built their life together. Emma came up the porch steps carrying a toddler, one of her younger children, and settled into a rocking chair near her parents. Samuel says there is talk of bringing the railroad through Pyramid City. He thinks it would be good for business, make it easier to ship cattle. The railroad, Yates mused. The world keeps changing, does it not? When I first came to Nevada, this was wild country. Now we have got trains and telegraphs and who knows what else. Some things do not change, Margaret said, squeezing his hand. Family does not change. Love does not change. The important things stay the same even when everything else is different. Emma smiled at her parents, seeing in their weathered faces and joined hands the kind of love she hoped to have with her own husband when they were old. She had grown up hearing the story of how her mother had nearly frozen to death on the trail, how Yates Brennan had saved them both and then made them a family. It was a story told at every family gathering, a reminder of where they had all come from, of how precious life was, of how quickly everything could change. The toddler in Emma's arms was named Margaret, after her grandmother, and she had the same determined expression that had characterized the original Margaret's entire life. Little Margaret reached for her grandmother, and Margaret took her, settling the small, warm body on her lap with practiced ease. "Tell me the trail story, Grandma," little Margaret demanded in the imperious way of 3-year-olds everywhere. Margaret laughed. "You have heard that story 100 times, but I want to hear it again." So Margaret told it again, editing the parts that were too frightening for young ears, focusing on the parts about Yates riding through the night to save them, about how brave her mother Emma had been as a baby, about how love could be found in the most unexpected places. She told it the way she had told it dozens of times before, to children and grandchildren, and she would tell it dozens of times more before she was done, because it was their story, hers and Yates's, and it deserved to be remembered. It deserved to be passed down through generations, a reminder that life could be hard and cruel, but it could also be beautiful and generous, that the worst night of your life could lead to the best years. That sometimes the person who saves your life becomes the love of your life, and those two things are not separate but intertwined, part of the same grand design. When the story was done, little Margaret was asleep on her grandmother's lap, and the sun had fully set, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Emma took her daughter and headed home to her own family, kissing both her parents goodnight, and Yates and Margaret were left alone once more. "We have done well," Yates said softly. "Look at what we built from nothing. Look at all these children and grandchildren who exist because I decided to ride home one cold night instead of making camp. We have done more than well. We have done wonderfully." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting against him as perfectly as she had 40 years earlier. "I love you, Yates Brennan. I have loved you for most of my life now, and I will love you for whatever time we have left. And I love you, Margaret Brennan. You made me believe in second chances, in new beginnings, in the possibility of finding joy after loss. You gave me everything that matters." They sat together under the stars, Two people who had found each other in the most desperate circumstances and built a life that exceeded all expectations. The ranch was quiet around them. The cattle settled for the night, the horses in the barn, the children and grandchildren in their various homes. It was peaceful, the kind of peace earned through decades of hard work and unwavering commitment to each other. When they finally went inside, Yates banked the fire while Margaret checked that all the doors were locked. They moved through the house with the synchronized efficiency of people who had performed these tasks together for 40 years, anticipating each other's movements, working as a single unit. In their bedroom, Yates helped Margaret with the buttons she could no longer easily reach, and she helped him with the boots that had become harder to remove as his hands stiffened with age. They climbed into bed together, the same bed where they had loved and fought and made up and dreamed for 4 decades. Yates pulled Margaret close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, that steady rhythm that had been the soundtrack of her life for so long. "Remember that first night I brought you here?" Yates asked quietly. "You were so scared, so exhausted. You fell asleep holding my hand." "I remember. I thought you were the kindest man I had ever met. I think I started falling in love with you that night, even though I did not realize it yet. I knew I loved you by morning. I woke up and saw you sleeping in that chair by the fire, Emma in your arms, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I decided right then that I was going to marry you if you would have me." Margaret laughed softly. "You were very patient about it. You waited almost 2 months before proposing. I wanted to give you time to heal, to be sure of your feelings. I did not want you to feel pressured or obligated. I never felt either of those things. I only felt loved." They drifted off to sleep together, and if their sleep was lighter than it had been in youth, if they woke more often and took longer to fall back asleep, they still found comfort in each other's presence. Margaret sometimes woke in the night and listened to Yates breathe, grateful for another day, another moment, another heartbeat. And Yates sometimes woke and pulled Margaret closer, marveling that this incredible woman had chosen to spend her life with him. One winter morning, nearly 45 years after that fateful night on the trail, Yates did not wake up. Margaret knew immediately, the way wives always know. She lay beside him for a long time, holding his hand, remembering their life together. She did not cry, not yet. Instead, she said goodbye quietly, thanking him for 45 years of love and partnership and joy. She thanked him for saving her and Emma, for giving them a family, for being the best man she had ever known. When she finally rose and went to tell the family, her children gathered around her with their own grief, but Margaret stayed strong. She had learned long ago that life demanded strength, that you survived what you had to survive. The funeral was large, attended by half the county, people whose lives Yates had touched over his 70 years. They told stories about his kindness, his integrity, his skill with cattle and horses. They spoke of how he had built a ranch from nothing, how he had employed and helped countless people, how he had been a pillar of the community. But the story Margaret held closest was the one only she knew fully. The story of a cowboy who rode through a frozen night to save a woman and her baby, who fell in love at first sight and then spent the rest of his life proving it, who built a family from tragedy and created joy from despair. Margaret lived another 10 years after Yates died, years spent surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. She stayed on the ranch, helped by Samuel and his family, insisting that this was her home and she would die here when her time came. She told the trail's story countless times to new generations, making sure everyone knew how the family began, how love could arrive in the darkest moment and transform everything. When Margaret finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, She was buried next to Yates in the Pyramid City Cemetery, under a headstone that read, Margaret Louise Brennan, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. At her funeral, Emma told the trail's story one more time, her voice breaking as she explained how her mother and Yates had found each other, how they had built something beautiful from something terrible. The ranch continued on, passed down through generations of Brennans, each one adding their own chapter to the family story. But the original story, the foundation upon which everything else was built, remained the same. The story of a woman who refused to give up even when death seemed certain, and a cowboy who appeared out of the darkness and rode through the night to save her. It was a story of love born from desperation, of family forged from loss, of hope emerging from tragedy. And it was true. Every word of it was true. The proof lived on in the faces of the descendants who worked the ranch, in the house that still stood solid after more than a century, in the love that passed from generation to generation, a legacy more valuable than any amount of cattle or land. Margaret and Yates had started with nothing but each other and a determination to build something better. And they had succeeded beyond measure, creating not just a ranch, but a family, a love story that would be told and retold for as long as anyone remembered the name Brennan. On cold November nights, when the wind howled across the high desert and the stars emerged bright and clear overhead, the descendants of Margaret and Yates would sometimes stand on the porch of the old ranch house and think about that night so long ago. They would imagine a desperate woman walking alone with a dying baby in her arms, and a cowboy making the decision to ride home instead of camp. They would marvel at how one small decision, made in a moment, had led to all of this: the ranch, the family, the generations of love. And they would be grateful. Grateful for the strength of their ancestors, grateful for the love that had sustained them through hard times, grateful for the story that reminded them where they came from and what they were capable of surviving. The trail might have been cold and cruel and unforgiving, but it had led Margaret Louise to Yates Brennan, and that had made all the difference. That was the story. That was the legacy. And it would endure for as long as there were Brennans to tell it, a testament to the power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the miracle of two people finding each other exactly when they needed to most.